At 77 years old, Margaret Winslow owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a small tin box of coins that jingled like the last echo of a life she used to have. Her own son, Thomas Winslow, had put her out of the house she'd raised him in, telling her plainly that she was a burden his young family could no longer carry. She had $11.40 to her name, counted twice with trembling fingers on the porch steps before he shut the door. With that money, she walked 3 miles to the docks of a town called Millhaven Bay and paid $9 for a half-sunken fishing boat that everyone had given up on, its hull green with rot, resting crooked in the shallows like a tired old animal put out to pasture. Folks said only a fool or a desperate woman would touch a wreck like that, but sealed inside that ruined hull was something that would not only change the rest of Margaret's days, it would return dignity to an entire town that had quietly forgotten how to hope. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Winslow. If you're watching from a place that feels forgotten, tell us in the comments. Margaret had been born in 1849 in a coastal village not unlike Millhaven Bay, the daughter of a net mender named Josiah Pratt, a man whose hands were so callous from rope and twine that he could grip a hot kettle without flinching. Her mother, Ruth, had died of fever when Margaret was 9, and so it fell to her, the eldest of 3, to learn her father's trade alongside him rather than staying home with dolls and needlework like the other girls in the village. She learned to read tide charts before she could read a full sentence in a primer. She learned to patch a net so tightly that not even a minnow could slip through, and she learned, most importantly, to listen to boats the way other people listen to people. For boats, her father always said, will tell you everything that's wrong with them if you only put your ear close enough and stop being in a hurry. Josiah Pratt was not a wealthy man, but he was a principled one. He mended nets and hulls for fishermen who could not pay him in coin, accepting instead a portion of their catch, a sack of potatoes, a promise remembered and honored come harvest. A hull is like a person, Maggie, he used to tell her, kneeling beside her in the boatyard with a plane in his hand, shavings curling onto the sand like ribbons. Most folks look at rot and see garbage, but rot only tells you where to start. It never tells you the whole story. She carried those words with her the way other people carried scripture, turning them over in quiet moments for the rest of her life. She married young at 19 to a shipwright's apprentice named Daniel Winslow, a serious, gentle man who admired that she could read a keel's curve better than most men twice her age. Together they moved inland for a time, following work, and eventually settled near the timber country, where Daniel found steady employment building barns and grain houses. Margaret raised their son, Thomas, teaching him what her father had taught her: patience, the dignity of fixing rather than discarding, the quiet pride of a job done honestly. She had hoped he would grow into a man who valued the same things. For many years, it seemed that he had. Daniel passed when Thomas was 22, a sudden collapse of the heart while hauling lumber, and Margaret found herself a widow with a grown son and a small cottage that was, at least, paid for outright. She kept herself busy mending sails to the local fleet, teaching herself new stitches from traveling sailors, and taking and mending work from anyone who would pay her a few coins. She was, by all accounts in that stretch of coast, a woman known for her steady hands and her unwillingness to see anything thrown away that could still serve a purpose: a torn coat, a cracked or a rusted lantern. Everything wants a second chance, she would tell the children who gathered sometimes to watch her work. Same as people do. Thomas married a woman named Eleanor from a family of some standing in a nearby town, a family that valued appearances a great deal more than Margaret ever had. Eleanor was not unkind, exactly, but she was anxious about status in a way that made her uncomfortable around her mother-in-law's plain dresses and calloused hands. Margaret moved in with them when her own health began to falter, and her cottage grew too much for her alone to keep. And for a few years, things were tolerable, even warm at times, especially when her grandchildren were small and loved to hear her stories of the sea. But the years turned the way years do, and Thomas's business, a modest dry goods store, began to struggle against a large and new establishment that opened 2 streets over. Money grew tight. Eleanor grew tighter still, and the small kindnesses that Margaret had once been shown began to feel, more and more, like obligations resented rather than affections given. The end came on an ordinary autumn afternoon, without much ceremony at all, which Margaret would later say was almost the cruelest part of it. Thomas sat her down at the kitchen table and told her, not unkindly but not gently either, that with the store failing and another child on the way, there simply was not room, in the house or in the family's finances, for her any longer. He offered no plan beyond a single suggestion, delivered like a closing of accounts, that she might find room to let somewhere cheap and manage as best she could. Margaret did not weep in front of him. She had learned long ago from her father that weeping rarely mended anything, and so she packed her small trunk with what little remained truly hers, a photograph of Daniel, her mother's silver thimble, her father's boat plane worn smooth with age, and she walked out that door with her head level, though her heart had cracked clean through. She took a coach as far as her coins would carry her, which left her in Millhaven Bay, a fishing town she had never visited but had heard spoken of kindly by traveling sailors years before, a town said to be built on honest work and salt air. She arrived with $11.40, a trunk, and a lifetime of knowledge that no bank would ever count as currency. She found a room above a chandlery, cheap and drafty, offered to her by a widow named Bertha Combs, who took one look at Margaret's straight back and steady eyes and decided, for reasons she couldn't quite explain even herself, to charge her less than she charged anyone else. It was on her third morning in Millhaven Bay, walking the docks, simply to feel the familiar comfort of salt water and gull cries, that Margaret came upon the wreck. It sat listing in the shallows at the far end of the pier, half submerged, painted boards peeling like sunburned skin, a boat that the harbor master, a weary man named Silas Odom, was eager to be rid of before it became a hazard to navigation. It had belonged, he told her, to a fisherman named Elias Voss who had died at sea some 15 years prior, leaving no family that anyone in town could locate, and the boat had simply sat rotting in the shallows ever since, an eyesore and a nuisance that no one wanted to spend the money to properly break apart and haul away. Margaret walked its length slowly, running her palm along the gunwale the way her father had taught her, feeling for the give and grain of the wood beneath the grime. Silas watched her with a mixture of amusement and pity, certain she was simply an old woman lost in memory. But Margaret's trained eye saw past the rot her father had spoken a decade before. She saw a keel that was sound, ribs that had been built by a craftsman who knew his trade, and a certain solidity beneath the neglect that told her the boat's bones, at least, were good. When Silas, mostly to be rid of the whole matter, said he'd let it go for $9 just to have it off the town's ledgers, Margaret didn't hesitate. She counted out the coins into his palm right there on the dock, and townsfolk who happened to be passing exchanged glances and small, pitying smiles. Certain the old widow had simply lost her senses along with her home. She began work on the boat the very next day, borrowing tools from Bertha's late husband's shed, and was on the second day of scraping away rot from the bow compartment, a small storage locker built into prow, sealed shut with corroded iron fittings, that her father's old boat plane, which he brought along almost as a talisman, struck something that did not give the way rotted would should give. Beneath the soft outer layer of decay, her fingers found a second wall, a false bottom fitted with a craftsman's precision that had nothing to do with the boat's ordinary construction. Her heart, she would later say, began to beat the way it had when she was 9 years old, and her father first let her hold the plane herself. It took her the better part of 2 days, working carefully so as not to damage whatever lay concealed, prying loose the false panel with the same patience her father had taught her decades before. Patience, he always said, was the difference between ruining a thing and revealing it. When the panel finally came away, she found inside an oilskin-wrapped bundle, remarkably preserved by the boat's dry construction and the tar sealant that had kept the compartment watertight, even as the rest of the hull decayed around it. Within the oilskin was a leather ledger, its pages foxed but legible, along with a small canvas pouch that, when she loosened its drawstring, revealed a modest collection of gold coins, not a fortune by any grand measure, but more money than Margaret had held in her whole life put together, along with several folded documents whose wax seals had cracked with age but whose ink had held remarkably true. The ledger, she soon discovered upon careful reading by lamplight that night, belonged to Elias Voss himself, and it was not merely an account book of catches and expenses. It was, in fact, a detailed record of cooperative fund that Elias had quietly built over the better part of 2 decades, a fund meant to support the widows and orphan children of fishermen lost at sea, financed by Elias setting aside a portion of every good catch, a practice he had apparently kept entirely secret from the town, perhaps out of humility, perhaps out of some old wound Margaret could only guess at. The documents folded alongside the coins were letters addressed but never sent, to a brother in the eastern part of the state, describing his intention to formalize the fund into a proper charitable trust before age or misfortune could rob him of the chance. A chance the sea itself had apparently stolen from him before he could act. Margaret sat with a ledger long into the night, tracing Elias Voss's careful handwriting by lamplight, and she understood immediately what she had been given. Not merely money, but a purpose that had been waiting 15 years for someone patient enough to find it. She thought of her father's words about rot only telling you where to start, and she thought too of the families in Millhaven Bay she had already come to know in her short time there, families who lived one bad storm away from ruin, much as her own late husband's people once had. She resolved, without a single moment's temptation to do otherwise, that Elias Voss's fund would finally exist as he had intended it, and that she, a woman thrown away by her own blood, would be the one to see it done. Word of Margaret's discovery could not stay quiet in a town the size of Millhaven Bay, and it did not take long before Silas Odom, embarrassed at having sold a fortune for $9 and eager to save face, began to argue publicly that the boat, and therefore whatever contained, had never been properly as to sell, since the town harbor authority technically held claim over abandoned vessels and their contents. He brought the matter before the town council, framing Margaret as an opportunist who had swindled a grieving town out of money that rightfully belonged to Millhaven Bay's coffers, conveniently omitting that he himself had been the one so desperate to unload the wreck that he'd all but given it away. The council meeting that followed was a tense affair held in the drafty town hall, with half the fishing families in attendance, murmuring about fairness and rightful ownership, some sympathetic to the strange old widow who had shown up with nothing, others swayed by Silas's louder and more familiar voice. Margaret stood before them with a ledger in her weathered hands, and rather than argue points of maritime law she knew nothing about, she simply began to read from Elias Voss's own words, his descriptions of widow Hattie Marsh, whose husband had drowned in a gale 11 years back, and who still lived in that very room, now elderly and unwell, of the Delacroix boys, orphaned at ages 6 and 8, now grown men still fishing those same waters. The room grew very quiet as Margaret read, and several old fishermen who remembered Elias Voss as a solitary, quietly generous man began to nod, recalling small kindnesses of his they had never understood until now. It was Bertha Combs, of all people, who rose and settled the matter more firmly than any lawyer might have, declaring plainly that she had trusted Margaret Winslow from the moment she laid eyes on her, and that any town willing to punish an old woman for honoring a dead man's dying wish rather than pocketing his gold herself did not deserve to call itself a community of honest folk. The council, chastened, voted to recognize Margaret as steward of the fund exactly as Elias Voss's ledger specified, with the modest gold serving as its founding capital, and Silas Odom, red-faced, quietly withdrew his complaint and never raised the matter publicly again, though it was noted that his own fortunes as harbor master grew notably more careful and less grasping from that day forward. With the town's blessing and the ledger as her guide, Margaret spent the following months restoring the boat herself, sanding and caulking and refitting with her own 2 hands, refusing offers of charity labor because, she said, Elias Voss had built his fortune through honest work, and it seemed right that his boat be restored the same way. When she finally relaunched the vessel, painted a deep, proud blue and rechristened in a small ceremony as the Second Chance, it became the first working vessel what Margaret organized as the Millhaven Fishermen's Mutual Fund, a cooperative exactly as Elias had envisioned, formalized at last with proper trustees, contributing fishermen, and clear provisions for widows and orphans. Hattie Marsh received the fund's first disbursement, enough to see her comfortably through the coming winter, and she wept openly in the town hall, clutching Margaret's hands and calling her in answer to prayers she'd stopped saying years before. Word of the fund's origins traveled beyond Millhaven Bay in time, as such stories do, and it reached Thomas Winslow through a cousin who had read of it in a regional paper, curious about the old widow's name matching his mother's. Whether from shame, curiosity, or something softer, Thomas came to Millhaven Bay himself the following spring. Finding Margaret at the docks overseeing repairs on a second boat the fund had since acquired. He apologized haltingly for having put her out with so little care for where she might land, and Margaret, true to the nature her father had instilled in her, did not turn him away, though she made clear that her home now was Millhaven Bay, among people who had come to value her not despite her age, but because of everything her years had taught her. Thomas returned home changed, if quietly, and began sending small sums to the fund each season. A private penance Margaret never spoke of publicly but accepted. She said, in the same spirit, her father had once accepted a sack of potatoes for an honest job of work. Not as full payment for what was owed, but as a start. At 77, cast out with almost nothing but a tin box of coins and a lifetime of skills no one thought to value, Margaret Winslow had bought a wreck nobody wanted for $9. And inside it she had found not merely gold, but the unfinished work of a lonely, generous man, waiting patiently for someone who understood that value is rarely where the world expects to find it. She restored the boat, and in restoring it, she restored a town's forgotten promise to its own widows and orphans, and in the process, she restored something in herself that her own son's rejection had nearly convinced her she'd lost for good. The ultimate karma, as it turned out, was not punishment visited upon those who had wronged her, but the quiet, undeniable proof that her worth had never depended on anyone else's willingness to see it. Margaret Winslow lived out the remainder of her years in Millhaven Bay, respected as a founder and steadfast steward of a fund that would go on long after her passing, to see dozens of families through their hardest winters. She never remarried, never sought fame beyond what naturally came to a woman who had done something so plainly good, and she kept her father's boat plane on a shelf in her small room above the chandlery until the end of her days. A reminder, she said, that rot only tells you where to start, never the whole of the story. Thank you for spending this time with Margaret's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you share it with someone who might need reminding that it's never too late for an overlooked life to matter tremendously. We'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something or someone that others had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.